Welcome to another episode of Erik Wait Whiskey Studies. In this video, I'm going to talk about Glen Garioch Distillery. But before I do, let me ask you a question. How many Scotch whiskey producers or independent bottlers can you name that have a deer, that is a stag or a hart, H-A-R-T, another word for a deer, as an icon? Now, there are some distilleries that have used a deer on a particular bottling, such as the Isle of Arran. However, I'm asking which ones use a deer as an icon. And then after you answer that question, I'll talk to you about Glen Garioch Distillery. Now, some of you may be asking, well, who gives a rat's ass? Who uses a deer as an icon for the distillery? Well, if you're studying for the Council of Whiskey Masters at the master's level, they're going to ask you, you have a written test, a panel, oral exam, and a blind tasting exam. And during the oral exam, they will ask you questions about production, but they may also ask you some obscure questions, wanting to see how deep a knowledge do you have about distilleries. So one of the things I've been doing, focusing on in recent videos, is on the icon, the image of distilleries. For example, Blair Athol means the burn or the water source, river of an otter. So their icon is an otter. So what distilleries have a deer as an icon? Now, just put a little bit of water into this one because this one's at cask strength, and it's going to need a little bit to sort of bring more out of it, bring things together, and bring down the ABV just a little bit. Well, if you answered the question, and if you need more time, you go ahead and pause this and then start again when you can think about who the producers are. Glenfiddich is probably the first that came to your mind because it means Valley of the Deer. Dalmore also has that deer label on their bottle. It's the silver-colored metal label on the bottom. And then Gordon and MacPhail, the independent bottler, has a stag or a deer on their label. But there's another one you may not have heard of, a distillery up in Orkney, a new distillery called Deerness. Deerness. Thus far, they've been producing gin and vodka, but they're now producing malt. They currently have a blended Scotch they have available, in which they're sort of partnering with another distillery until their own malt gets mature enough. But they currently have malted whiskey, single malt Scotch, being matured in casks. But it's going to be a few years, probably till we see anything out of that. At which time we'll have 3 distilleries, Highland Park, Scapa, and Deerness, on the Isle of Orkney, producing single malt. Now, there's another distillery, might not have come to your mind, that's having a deer as an icon, and that is actually Glen Garioch. Now, the thing is, if you look at the label on the bottle, there's no deer on there. Look on the website, you don't see a lot of deers on there. There's only one place I've seen a deer used as an icon for Glen Garioch, and that's on one of their stills. Now, I don't know if they plan on using it as a brand image or as an actual icon, or just for whatever reason they put a deer on their still. Now, if I was starting a distillery in Scotland, I would put a Highland cow, one of those long red-haired, horned cows, as an icon. It is like the icon in terms of animals for Scotland, and so that's what I would put as an icon. Now, as I'm giving this a slight whirl here, let me tell you a little bit more about Glen Garioch Distillery. They're very limited core range. There's some other special offerings, and then this independent bottle from the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. Glen Garioch Distillery is located in the Eastern Highlands, 17 miles from Aberdeen, Scotland. It is the most easterly distillery in Scotland. The name Glen Garioch means Valley of Granaries. Glen Garioch Distillery was founded in 1797 by John and Alexander Manson. It is one of the oldest distilleries in Scotland. In 1994, the distillery was bought by Beam Suntory. Glen Garioch Distillery production. They use a 4-ton lauter mash tun. They have 8 stainless steel washbacks with a fermentation time of 72 hours. They have 1 wash still, 1 spirit still, and a 3rd still that has not been used in a long time. The Glen Garioch Core Range. The Glen Garioch 1797 Founders Reserve Single Malt Scotch Whisky, matured in ex-bourbon cask and ex-sherry cask, bottled at 48% alcohol by volume. And the Glen Garioch 12-year-old Single Malt Scotch Whisky, matured in ex-bourbon and ex-sherry cask. It is also bottled at 48% alcohol by volume. Glen Garioch also periodically releases hand-selected individual batches of stock, launched as single batch releases. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society cask number 19.56, Walk the Talk. It is a Glen Garioch 18-year-old single malt Scotch whisky. It was matured in first fill bourbon cask for 18 years. It was distilled in February 2003. It's bottled at 59.3% alcohol by volume. And the United States was allotted 126 bottles. And it sold for $185 on release. So I've been working on this Scotch Malt Whisky Society bottling from 18-year-old from Glen Garioch, got it down to about here. When I first opened up, smelling and tasting it, it had a very, what I think is a distinctive Glen Garioch trait. However, one, it can be challenging to understand what is the basic essence of a distillery if they only have a couple bottles in their lineup. You know, Ardbeg has the 5-year-old, the 10-year-old, the Quevrechen, the Ugadal, the NO, and the 19-year-old, plus a lot of committee releases bottles. So if you're trying all those various whiskeys, you can kind of say, okay, here's this particular trait in the whiskeys that gives us that Ardbegness. But when a distillery only has 2 core range bottles, and one of them, the non-age statement, is really hard to come by, at least in my neighborhood. There are some whiskey tubers that have reviewed it, but when I look online, I don't see it in my neighborhood, but it seems to be more common perhaps in the UK and Europe. But the 12-year-old does make a good presence, and it seems to have a better distribution than the non-age statement. Usually it goes the other way. The NAS, easier to produce because you don't have an age statement on it, but the 12-year-old seems to be making its rounds. If you haven't had the Glen Garioch 12-year-old, I highly recommend it. I've already reviewed this. This is a fantastic bottle. The non-age statement one is the 1797 Founders Reserve. Now, both, as you saw there in the notes, both the 12-year-old and the Founders Reserve are bourbon cask and sherry cask. This one, however, this independent one from Scotch Malt Whisky Society is bourbon cask, first fill bourbon cask. And yet, when I first tried it, it has some characteristics to it, a little hard to describe, that are similar to this 12-year-old. And when in my review of the 12-year-old, I'm going to say as well here, there's a certain character about Glen Garioch that it seems like it has an old world character. And it's hard to describe, but it's similar to Glenturret in some ways, and it's similar to Springbank. It's a sort of a slight funk. Now, when I had reviewed the 12-year-old, I thought that character was coming from the sherry cask. That this was a remnant of the sherry cask, because it's bourbon and sherry cask, and they've kind of dialed it in. If you look at the color, it's not super dark, but it's also not super light. So it's got a good even balance there. If you look at the Scotch Malt Whisky Society 18-year-old, it has a little bit of color there, but you can get that kind of color from a bourbon cask if you've got enough age. But if I had to guess, if I was doing this blind, I would say, just visually, it might have a touch of sherry cask in there to give that kind of color. And it has this distinctive funk, this old world earthy dirt character that I get on the 12-year-old. It also has more spice than what you typically get from a bourbon cask. A bourbon cask, you're typically going to get more baking spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, maybe a little bit of clove. But on this, I'm getting like a pepper character, black licorice, which I got a little of that on the 12-year-old. That does have vanilla, caramel, stewed fruits, so not fresh, not dried, but stewed. I'm getting more vanilla now than I normally have off of this. That is definitely the bourbon cask. I do get some baking spices, but that licorice note, I'm like, okay, where in the heck is that coming from? Where is that slight earthy character coming from? The earthy character can come from if you have peat, and years ago, Glen Garioch did a little bit of peat. They don't currently. However, in 2021, they did restore their malting floors. So apparently, about 20% of their current production is going to be from their own malted barley. But that was in 2021. At the time of this recording, it's 2025. It's only been 4 years. It's probably going to be a few more years before we start seeing bottlings from Glen Garioch in which they have used some of their own floor malt. But you can also get that character from a dunnage warehouse. That slight sort of earthy, dusty character, which is one of the challenging things about blind tasting. There are some characteristics that are distinctly from one particular part of the production process. But there are some traits you can get from more than one part of the process. For example, you can get a pepper note from peated whiskey, say like Talisker. You can get that pepper character from if there's rye used or a rye cask was used. You can get an herbal character from some sherry cask. You can get, well, dried black fruit notes you're typically going to get from a sherry cask. Apple and pear normally is going to be from a longer fermentation for the mash. But if you previously used, if they matured in a Calvados cask, you can get that character. Some bourbon cask might give you an apple pie character. Again, now you're dipping into the apple character. So, and one important thing in studying production is learning how to retro-engineer a whiskey and know what characteristic comes from what. So, what are you going to get from a worm tub versus a shell and tube condenser? What are you going to get from a longer fermentation than you would from a shorter fermentation? We're going to get from a taller still than a short stout still. Where are you going to get from a sherry cask versus a bourbon cask? Where are you going to get, and on and on and on, right? There's all these little things that can contribute to the profile, aromas, and flavors of a whiskey. So in studying production, I did a whole long series on production. Highly recommend it. Watching those, I'll put a link at the end of this video. But it also is going to require you, if you can, get some hands-on experience working in the distillery to get a better in-depth sense of what is going on in the distillery. But then smelling and tasting and contrasting and comparing whiskeys that you know how they were made and go, oh, you know what? From all of these dunnage warehouse whiskeys, I get this character. From all these racked, tall racked warehouse, I get this character. Which makes you think about Springbank. Springbank, traditionally they had dunnage, but when they increased their production, they're now running 24/7, 365 days a year, just about, almost. They had to build a rack warehouses, which is going to have differences in temperature fluctuation, but also they don't have the earthen floors. So whatever whiskeys are coming out of that warehouse, which would also include casks from Glen Garioch, their other distillery next door, those will be different than their dunnage warehouse bottlings. All right. So in studying Scotch whiskey production and doing comparison with various whiskeys and wanting to understand, you need to understand what causes what, so you can retro-engineer whiskey, understand how the whiskey was made, as well as to understand what you like in a whiskey and what type of production are you looking for at a distillery to get the characteristics that you want? Also, so that if something is given to you blind, you can perhaps identify it if you can pull out these particular traits to it. But also recognize if something seems really off, is that something in production? Did they go too far into the tails? Is it a weak cask? Or is it something that came from a bad cork? So you also have to kind of figure out flaws and odd characteristics that aren't particularly normal. Again, learning a distillery's character, what is typical of them, is difficult when they have such a limited range. All right, so I've done a lot of talking now, given some time to these whiskeys to aerate. Now, when I was first tasting this, smelling this, I was like, wait a minute. I double checked my notes. I'm like, no, bourbon cask. Yeah, but this has this trait that's like this. I'm like, but this, the 12-year-old, does have a little bit more slight sulfur note, a little bit more dried black fruit note, and definitely color. If I put these next to each other, definitely the 12-year-old is darker, but there does seem to be a little bit of color, excuse me, I'm recording this late at night, a little bit of color on the SMWS bourbon cask version, but there is a Glen Garioch in this whiskey, and I haven't the foggiest idea where it's coming from, because previously I thought it was coming from the sherry cask. I now think it could be, if they're using dunnage warehouses, that funk could be coming from a dunnage warehouse, or just somehow, whatever the heck there is they're doing in the way in which they do their cuts. All right, so I've already reviewed this one, but I'm going to give you some notes on it anyway. Even as I was bringing it up to my nose, I got a slight waft of that sulfury note, a little bit of smokiness to it. Smelling and tasted blind, you might think this had a little bit of peat. Dried black fruit notes, figs, dates, raisins. There's an umami character. There's a savory character. It starts off sweet, then goes savory, even a little bit of saltiness, an earthy character. It has a pretty long finish. A little bit of pepperiness, a little bit of an herbal character. I really like this whiskey. This, though, is, if you're old school, if you're a newbie, this may not be up your, might not be your cup of tea, because it's not young, fruity, fresh, and character. This one, if you can get a bottle or another independent bottle from Glen Garioch, it has that herbal character, it has that black licorice character. It has this old world character to it. Earthy, a little bit of chocolate, that herbal character to it. Again, if doing blind, okay, this is from Beam Suntory. Beam Suntory owns Maker's Mark, which is a wheater. We also obviously own Jim Beam Distillery. Jim Beam does use some rye in their mash bill. Is there a possibility that they're getting their cask from Jim Beam of maybe higher rye bourbon casks, and what we're getting is a remnant of a high rye bourbon cask? Is that where those traits of character, those characteristics coming from? Because if I was tasting a bourbon and it had those characteristics, I would say, oh, this is a high rye bourbon. That's where we're getting black licorice, and that's where we're getting a little herbal character, and even like that dusty, you can get kind of that dusty, earthy character from rye as well, because that's how it comes across. Again, I'm spitballing here based on previous experience and what I know about the distillery, but it's the mystery I have going on here is how I'm getting some similar traits between a bourbon cask and another one that is sherry and bourbon cask. Now, what do I think about these whiskeys? These are fantastic. Would like to see Glen Garioch expand their core range. You've got a 12-year-old, you have this non-age statement Founders Reserve, and they have these vintage bottlings that are rare releases. Those are hard to come by. They need to expand the core range a little bit. let's say a 10-year-old. That's maybe a couple years down the road when they actually start releasing their floor malted versions of their spirits. Have maybe a special release of that. I think they may have also had like a virgin oak version release a while back. That was, you know, a limited release. But I'm talking about core range. I'd like to see more come out of this distillery because Glen Garioch, Glen Turret, and Springbank, I think, are on a line of old world, old funky style Scotch whiskeys that have more of a savory note that I really, really like. This is absolutely superb. I know you can harder than hell to get a hold of it, but if you could get a hold of it, I would highly recommend it. And I'd give it a score of like 95 points. It's that complex. It has that much depth. It has that much variation. It has a really long finish. It's absolutely superb. All right, so what I want to know from you is, have you had Glen Garioch 12-year-old? Have you had the Founders Reserve? I haven't been able to find it. If I can find one, I'll get one. Have you had the Founders Reserve, and what did you think of it? All right, if you like watching my videos and you've already subscribed, well, thank you very much. If you've not yet subscribed, actually subscribe, ring the bell to be notified when I go live or post a video. And until next time, Slanja. Hey, don't forget to subscribe and check out these other whiskey videos.